listening to Diasporic music with Melinda Francis and Norman Richmond. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, a regular contributor to Diasporic music, and we are anxiously awaiting his latest book, Armed Struggle. And it's going to be talking about the Black Panthers, the communists, and other forces in Southern California. And Dr. Horne, how are you feeling today, sir?
It's all good. What about you all?
We're doing well.
Well, I'm fine. I'm fine. I can't complain. I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to the book. Has anything leaked to the press yet?
No. Be patient. I know you, as I said, you're a character in this book, so perhaps that's why you're eagerly anticipating it.
Yeah, I guess so. Like as John Hendricks Clark used to say, at my age, I'm anxiously anticipating any and everything.
Hey, I hear you. As they say in my neighborhood, I'm so old I don't even buy green bananas anymore.
Is that some St. Louis talk, or is that from Mississippi, or both?
That's from Harlem.
Oh yeah, let me stop. Let me shut up. Yeah, the Harlem is they're too slick. They're too slick in Harlem. Yeah, but I guess we wanted to. Melinda, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, let's go to Putin and Xi Summit.
This has been huge. The meeting of President Putin and President Xi Jinping. This is perhaps the 41st, 42nd time that they've met, either face-to-face or virtually in person. It was culminated with a bear hug that Xi Jinping administered to Mr. Putin. First, he looked both ways to make sure the cameras were ready to capture the moment as he gave this profound signal, and then wrapped Mr. Putin in a bear hug. It reminded me on the flip side of the bear hug administered by Joseph R. Biden to Benjamin Netanyahu shortly after October 7, 2023. And by the way, to show you how pressure works, at his eagerly anticipated commencement address at Morehouse College in Atlanta, the alma mater of Spike Lee, Dr. King, Samuel L. Jackson, etc., reputedly, Mr. Biden came out for a ceasefire, which heretofore has been a demand of his left-wing detractors. Well, so we'll see how that works out. In any case, back to Xi and Putin. It's apparent that Washington and the North Atlantic countries have outfoxed themselves. What I mean is that they thought that they had pulled off a real coup about a half century ago when they were able to enlist Maoist China and the anti-Soviet Entente. This led, A, to the collapse of the Soviet Union by 1991, but B, the payoff was massive direct foreign investment into China. Interestingly enough, one of the many U.S. diplomats who shepherded this monumental trend was Leonard Woodcock, who theretofore had been the leader of the United Auto Workers and then became U.S. ambassador to China at a time when U.S. manufacturing plants were shutting down and being shipped across the Atlantic. That's the kind of so-called working class leadership that has characterized these United States of America. And so now China is the factory floor of the world. It out-manufactures not only the United States, but basically all of the United States and its G7 allies combined, believe it or not. And here is one takeaway amongst many. Given the fact that the United States would like to now monumentally transform this relationship with China, that is to say, decouple, delink You saw that Mr. Biden has slapped tariffs on Chinese products coming across the Pacific. China, in order to flummox U.S. imperialism, has begun to try to build up markets in Africa, for example, which involves building up the working class in Africa, putting more money into the hands of African consumers, for example, so that they can begin to absorb these products that theretofore would have been going to the United States of America. And to give you one example amongst many, you have Chinese manufacturers manufacturing electric vehicles, the wave of the future, that in China cost less than $10,000. Now, of course, that would be too much for the US market because Ford and General Motors and, in fact, even Tesla want to profiteer. And so these electric vehicles, inevitably, it seems to me, will wind up in Africa, where that price point is something that many African consumers can deal with. Of course, many can deal with the United States, but because of the tariffs, they will not be able to enjoy that particular product. And so to look at what's happening from 30,000 feet, we're going through this monumental shift in the global correlation of forces. For at least half a millennium, the United States and its North Atlantic compadres, particularly London, have been in the driver's seat. But now, slowly but surely, that's beginning to change. And you saw that with regard to the 8,000-word communique emerging from the Putin-Xi Summit, where they not only plan to increase trade in their own currencies, that is to say, in the renminbi and in the ruble, moving away from the dollar. And so what you see, to put it in the terms of astronomy, is that a new economic solar system is being constructed. The solar system to this point on planet Earth has had the United States in the center, particularly since 1945. But now you see a new solar system being constructed with the BRICS at the center: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You have a number of nations knocking on their door to join. We know that coming in terms of the meeting in Russia later this year will be Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And by the way, with regard to Iran, the bad news is that I'm afraid to say that Israel has struck back. As we speak, a helicopter with the president of Iran and his foreign minister has gone down. There has been no report as of yet with regard to their whereabouts or well-being, but excuse the speculation, which I usually try to steer clear of, but I'm inclined to suspect that the hand of Israel, not to mention the hand of US imperialism, has something to do with this apparent fatal crash, although I don't think that it will change materially the trajectory of Iranian foreign policy, which means that just as when Mr. Trump assassinated General Soleimani during the latter stages of Mr. Trump's administration, that did not change materially the trajectory of Iranian military strategy. But in any case, back to the major threat, you also see in this 8,000-word communique that Moscow and Beijing are planning to try to erode the domination of the North Atlantic powers in the information space with regard to the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, BBC, etc. That's a breath of fresh air if they are able to accomplish it. And so once again, we are in the foothills of a monumentally profound change in the global correlation of forces. I trust and I hope that many of our friends of the Black Liberation Movement are keeping up with this, but somehow I doubt it. But we shall see.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power. Let me ask you this question. In terms of this 8,000-word document, is there any way, is there the technology there where you can actually listen to it being read, for people that are, not that well at reading. Is there we have all this AI stuff now. Is there any technology where you can actually get this document and have someone read it to you or help you read it?
Well, I imagine so. I mean, I think if you have access to a search engine, you can just plug in the keywords, Xi, Putin, 8,000 word communique, and just play with that. And I'm sure you can find that. Sure, why not?
Okay, yeah, because I mean, technology is. I've been listening to all this music in AI, and it's. We'll talk about that at another time. But I want to ask you about Egypt, Ireland, Turkey, or Türkiye have joined the South African suit at the ICJ, International Court of Justice, on Israel. How should we see that?
Well, you should see it as another step towards the diplomatic isolation of the piratical state that is Israel and its main aider and abettor, speaking of the United States of America. And by the way, on the New York Times website as we speak, it's a very lengthy article that's quite informative, talking about the lawlessness that the Israeli authorities have imposed on the West Bank, which we already knew about. But the conclusion drawn in this New York Times article, some of your readers might find startling. The conclusion is that the strength of the right wing in Israel is so potent and so genocidal that they're threatening to destabilize the Israeli state from the right, believe it or not. And of course, reference is made to the assassination of Mr. Rabin, the Israeli leader who was trying to deal with Chairman Arafat during the Clinton years. He, of course, was assassinated. And the right-wing approach is that from the river to the sea, to use that phrase that is scorned when Palestinian supporters use it, from the river to the sea, say these ultra-Zionists, there should be no Arabs. There should be no Palestinians. I mean, it's like Texas in the 1850s, for example, in terms of the genocidal impulse towards the population. This is quite serious. But in any case, back to the more positive news, not only have Egypt, Ireland, and Türkiye joined South Africa in this litigation at the International Court of Justice, but also you see that diplomatically speaking, Spain, Slovenia, of course, being the homeland of both Melania Trump and Luka Doncic, the star forward/guard for the Dallas Mavericks. They are expected to recognize the emerging Palestinian state along with Ireland, and Ireland needs a special shout out for their vanguard role in terms of Palestinian rights. I should also say that at the vote of the United Nations, which marked an upgrade of the Palestinian diplomatic status, a vote taken at the General Assembly, all 193 member states participating. Of course, the United States voted against the upgrade, but voting to abstain were Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, even Great Britain. And that, too, is a straw in the wind with regard to the gathering diplomatic isolation of the Israeli authorities. We do not have to consult our crystal ball to suspect that in the wings is a brewing clash within the U.S. ruling class between the Zionist wing and the not-so-Zionist wing. The latter wants to focus on this China-Russia alliance, quote unquote, but how can they do so when the United States is bogged down in historic Palestine and suffering diplomatic and reputational damage as a direct result? We see that in this context, as the United States is bogged down in historic Palestine, that China is surging ahead, not only in the aforementioned electric vehicles, but in space exploration, green energy, quantum computing. And by the way, as you probably have gathered with all of this talk about electric vehicles, that puts a premium on copper, which is used to transmit electricity. And that brings us to Zambia, a major producer of copper. That brings us to Chile, a major producer of copper. So keep your eyes on Zambia, because as many of our friends are highly critical for whatever reason, sometimes for reasons good and bad, of South Africa, they should be paying more attention to Zambia, which is in many ways in the corner of US imperialism and conspiring against its neighbors, including Zimbabwe and South Africa and Namibia and Angola, etc. I'd like to see our friends focus more on that. But anyway, back to the major thread, we also see that the pro-Zionist wing of the US ruling class is putting enormous pressure on the exercise of democratic rights. There was an article in the Washington Post yesterday about how the Zionist billionaires had put pressure on Mayor Eric Adams of New York. They didn't have to put that much pressure on him to get him to send police to Columbia University and other campuses to crack down, but they put the pressure on him anyway. And of course, in return, he will be receiving lush campaign donations. We saw that on April 30th, Zionist thugs attacked peaceful protesters at UCLA and Westwood. They must have thought they were on the West Bank, attacking Palestinians as opposed to Westwood. So what we see is a boomerang effect. That is to say, we've been predicting for some time that US imperialism cannot blithely squash democratic rights abroad, be it in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, without that boomeranging coming back to haunt us here in North America. We see that taking place as we speak. And if we're not careful, the worst will come shortly. I should also say that with regard to South Africa, the elections are coming up in a few weeks. We see that there is gross interference in South African internal affairs by US imperialism. A leader of the ultra-right Freedom Front, for example, a neo-apartheid party, he appeared at a session with the Hudson Institute, which is a right-wing US think tank. And this is quite ominous in terms of this gross interference in South African internal affairs that I've just made reference to. I trust and I hope that folks will pay attention to that development. But in any case, the bottom line is that the ICJ case is proceeding as well it should, given the fact that we see that mass graves have been uncovered in historic Palestine. Famine continues to halt Palestinians there. And we see a slow motion genocide unfolding in historic Palestine. And thankfully, South Africa is trying to do something about it.
Listening to Diasporic music, I wanted to say something about Zambia. I remember many years ago, I was at the Pan-African Film Festival. And there was a comedian from Zambia, he was doing an act at the Pan-African Film Festival, and I, pulled him over and was telling him about what I knew about Zambia. So he looked at me and he says, "You must be." I said, "You from Lusaka?" So he looked at me and he says, "You must work for the CIA." And he says, or the FBI. Then he busts out laughing. He says, the reason I'm saying that is because, most of Africa, most of your tribe in America don't know anything about. Only thing you guys know about is South Africa and Nigeria. But I guess it was. No, I forgot. I've been looking for his name. I can't remember, but he was quite a comedian. And I think what really threw him off was because I had mentioned the brother that was in Ghana when Ghana was overthrown. We talk about him all the time here. He moved to Zambia when Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. I think he was originally born in Canada.
W. Alpheus Hunton.
Yes, yes. Walter Rodney, I think, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Hunting inspired How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Walter, he actually acknowledges that in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Yeah, Alpheus Hunting, I've written about him. I wrote about him in my DC book because he was a professor at Howard University for a number of years, particularly in the 1930s, alongside Ralph Bunche, who, of course, defects to the dark side, becoming an official at the United Nations and helping to negotiate the ouster of the Palestinians from Historic Palestine, 1947, 1948, for which he wins a Nobel Peace Prize. And Ralph Bunche, of course, had roots in Los Angeles before decamping to Washington, D.C., and then to Manhattan. And of course, biographers of Ralph Bunche have pointed out an interesting paradox, although when I enunciate it, you can see the dialectical connection. That is to say, at work, he was known as being unflappable and even-tempered, but at home, he was a holy terror.
I won't go into anything. I won't mention any names, but I remember almost getting into physical fights with some of my best friends about Ralph Bunche. I thought Ralph Bunche was well, I didn't think he played some roles in getting Patrice Lumumba. He played. I think it's overall, in my judgment, I think he was on the wrong side of. He was a stooge of imperialism, and that's how I see him. But maybe I'm wrong.
I doubt it.
Melinda, you have any more questions?
Yes.
Melinda must
I'm back on. So let's talk about your armed struggle book.
Well, yes, it's being printed as we speak. It should be out within days and or weeks. It covers Southern California from the 1920s through the late 1970s, dealing in the first chapters with the role of the Communist Party and then trying to show the connection between the Communist Party and the Panther Party. For example, Huey P. Newton confesses to being influenced by a number of the cases in Oakland, led in the 1950s by the Civil Rights Congress, spearheaded by the San Francisco-born Black lawyer William Patterson, who in turn influenced the late, great Paul Robeson. And I also talk about how the Panthers, especially the leadership, was deeply influenced by socialist thought. Now, one of the things I've noticed about some of our scholars nowadays is because they're not into socialist thought. When they write the history, they elide or ignore how the Panthers were influenced by socialist thought, which of course does a disservice to the historical record, which is one of the things I'm trying to correct in this book. And I'm making a number of other points too. I'm trying to problematize the question of the lumpen. And I argue in part that one of the reasons why the Panthers attached themselves to that concept was because of a lack of confidence in the working class, because we know that inherent in settler colonialism, which is what we have been enduring in North America, is the very concept of class collaboration. That is to say, the working class of the settlers too often collaborating with the ruling class of the settlers. And of course, you cannot explain this Trump phenomenon and why he's ahead in the polls and why so many are suggesting the United States might be on the verge of fascism unless you understand the concept of settler colonialism and class collaboration. So in any case, this concept of the lumpen, I'm not sure how many favors it did for the Panthers, although I think you can draw a straight line from this valorizing of the concept of the lumpen and the fact that nowadays the term pimp, which should be considered in an odious fashion, is now quite a noun, a verb, and an adjective in ordinary, everyday lingo in the United States of America. And I could go on in this vein, but I think that folks get the drift. Look for this book, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, within days, within weeks.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. And what about your other, the book on Washington, D.C.? What kind of traction is that? How is that book doing?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to talk about it, not only because I'm in Washington, D.C. now and run into people who are familiar with this text. And of course, it would be somewhat self-serving, which I try to avoid for me to give a critical analysis of this book. But I will say that as a person who's in Washington now doing research on the question of slavery in the District of Columbia, that is to say the period up to 1865, there are a number of revelations. Perhaps your audience can help me to figure them out. What I mean is that Baltimore, and of course I'm sure you're familiar with the classic song by the late great Nina Simone on that, Maryland City, had one of the largest free Negro populations in the United States of America. And of course, Baltimore is a twin of Washington, 30 odd miles up the highway. And the authorities in Maryland were always trying to figure out a way to get rid of the free Negroes. I mean, that's the origins and root of Liberia, for example. If you look at the early leaders of Liberia, most of them had roots in the free Negro population of Maryland and or Virginia, which of course is on the other side of the District of Columbia. And one of the points made by the authorities in Maryland was that when Negroes were emancipated or freed, that meant fundamentally that they no longer were property of one man. That meant that they were property of the state. Now, I'm going to have to do some digging to figure out what was the implication of that. But certainly, I suspect that you can draw a connection between this concept of free Negroes being properties of the state to the rise of the prison industrial complex, because, of course, this spectacular incarceration rate of Black Americans in the 21st century fundamentally means that those behind bars are the property of the state to a certain degree. I mean, they engage in free labor. For example, I just gave a blurb for a book edited by Andrew Ross of New York University on this notion of free prison labor that is common in this country. So in any event, look for my next book, Slavery's Capital of Human Bondage in Washington, D.C., slated to be published next year.
When we're talking about Washington, D.C. and talking about Baltimore, we have to talk about Sonny Till. And Sonny Till was that song, You Saw Me Crying in the Chapel, which was Bob Marley later on did it. Selassie in the chapel. Sonny Till, he came through here many years ago, but Sonny Till was one of the bird groups, I guess. Sonny Till was that? Yes, Selassie in the Chapel, and then there was another song called. It was by the Zion Travelers out of some of those. One of the brothers in the Zion Travelers' name was Felton Vernon. He went to school with all my mother and all my aunts and uncles, but he was the bass singer in the Zion Travelers. That song is like I say, Bob Marley really, Selassie in the Chapel. If you go to Google or go to YouTube and you can check that song out. Is there anything else you'd like to add, sir?
Well, only that we need to keep the pressure on with regard to this crisis in historic Palestine. If these news reports are accurate with regard to Mr. Biden calling for a ceasefire, we can chalk that up as yet another victory for this progressive movement. And once again, I think that ideologically, this movement also has created ripples. We mentioned more than once on this program how we've imploded this notion of identity politics used to defame the Black liberation movement, but never, and I underline never, being used against an exclusivist state built on an ethno-religious identity, speaking of Israel. That is to say, this notion of identity politics really has been an expression, a naked expression of white supremacy and the privileges of white supremacy. And likewise, calling Israel a settler state causes us to reflect upon that old saying that when you point one finger, you have three fingers pointing back at you. That is to say, the three fingers pointing back at us after we point the finger at Israel as a settler colonial state is that the United States is a settler colonial state. Canada is a settler colonial state, with all that that implies, all that that suggests. So once again, we congratulate those who've inaugurated this student movement for their victories, and we look forward to further victories being chalked up sooner rather than later.
And I guess we will definitely check you out next week, sir.